A gold standard is just a fiat money system with a fixed gold price. If you look at it that way, MMT MMT makes much more sense in any given monetary system because the government still prints money under a gold standard. They are just constrained in their printing by the requirement of keeping the gold price constant.
So I've got a couple of quotes here, and you can tell me whether this works, right? So the central idea of MMT is that the government with a fiat currency, or that governments with a fiat currency system under their control can and should print or create with a few keystrokes in today's digital age as much money as they need to spend, because they cannot go broke or be insolvent unless a political decision to do so is taken. Some say such spending would be fiscally irresponsible, as the debt would balloon and inflation would skyrocket. But according to MMT, large government debt isn't the precursor to collapse we have been led to believe it is. Countries like the US can sustain much greater deficits without cause for concern, and a small deficit or surplus can be extremely harmful and cause a recession, since deficit spending is what builds people's savings. Now, again, there's a lot of counterintuitive stuff. Hey, I don't mind counterintuitive. You know, the speed of light being constant is counterintuitive. Time slowing down when you go faster is counterintuitive. The fact that the world is round is counterintuitive. I'm no problem with counterintuitive, but this goes so much against what we both have been taught and what we experience in our own household income versus spending situation. Is that a reasonable characteristic? And you know what? I'll copy this in the chat over here as well, so you don't have to try and remember. But is that a reasonable characteristic of the theory that we can use as a sort of kickoff point?
I mean, I would say partially yes, partially. There's a lot of things in there. For example, spend however much the government needs. That's pretty open to interpretation. How much do they need? Is it how much they claim they need? How do we assess how much they need? So we don't necessarily agree with that part of it, but a lot of it is basically what we're saying. Yeah, I would say.
And then I would nitpick at the very beginning. So it says here the central idea of MMT is that governments with a fiat currency system. This implies that there's governments without a fiat currency system, and this is another thing that's kind of emotionally hard to get over.
I think that's to differentiate from historical systems like gold standard systems and so on.
No, well, so the government decreed gold standard. It's still fiat.
Well, I mean, early America, right? Without a central bank, without government control of the banking supply and so on, or, there's some examples,
let's take early America as an example. Pennsylvania, for example, did specifically this. So if Pennsylvania is an interesting case study, this is like colonial Pennsylvania, is that they would issue currency, paper currency, and for public projects, and then collect it in taxes later. Mm-hmm. And they didn't have a gold standard.
Yeah.
And I know that there's actually a pretty big argument between G. Edward Griffin and the American Monetary Institute guys like Bill Still over what exactly was causing the depression in the colonial era, whether it was a lack of gold and silver or whether it was a lack of simply paper money. But personally, I think it's a lack of understanding here, where whatever one it is, there needs to be enough of it.
I mean, I would add to that, and I've explained this a couple of times. A gold standard is just a fiat money system with a fixed gold price. If you look at it that way, MMT makes much more sense in any given monetary system because the government still prints money under a gold standard. They are just constrained in their printing by the requirement of keeping the gold price constant. So now we're keeping the price of a commodity fixed because people think it makes sense. That's just what we're assuming. But we're basically intervening in the market with the paper money that, once again, the government creates.
Well, no, but I would say that, this comes back to, it's a kind of moral argument. It's a little bit extra economic, but I think it's kind of a moral philosophy primarily. So the question is, okay, who on earth can handle the power of currency creation? Who can possibly not be corrupted by the power to create currency? And so I think one of the arguments behind the gold standard is, okay, well, at least there was some constraint on the creation of currency because the currency markers, the fiat currency or the gold-backed currency, had to be convertible to gold. So there was some kind of limit on what you could type into your own bank account. It had to be limited by the amount of gold available, either at the bank or at the Fort Knox or whatever. And so when you get unconstrained money creation, whatever economic arguments you might make for that, the argument which I'm going to push pretty hard, and I'm perfectly happy to be disproven on this, is that, well, human beings can't handle that kind of power. Like, you can set up whatever structure you want and say, well, the government should spend money until it reaches maximum employment, and then it should scale it back a little bit. And if inflation starts, then it should raise taxes, not as a way of redistributing income or as a way of gaining income, but as a way of just cooling down inflation or whatever. The problem is, of course, that who can handle that kind of power? I mean, we certainly see that nobody can handle the kind of power that the fiat banking system has at the moment. I mean, we can very much see that they'll move the money printing based upon financial interests. They'll move interest rates based upon who they want to win the presidency and who they don't want to win the presidency. So I think I haven't seen that discussed much in MMT. And of course, one of the things that we mentioned earlier is that people, like the leftists, they don't understand that people respond to incentives. So we look at incentives like, well, if you pay people to stay home, they won't want to go and get face baked in the melting forehead scenario of being a dishwasher at a fast-paced restaurant for 8 hours a day. They just won't want to do it because I'm pleasant, being a plongeur in the George Orwell style. But in the same way, people respond to incentives. Okay, so you have the power to create currency. You have the power to create currency, and then you have the power as to who it gets distributed to first, which is an enormous power. And I've not seen much in MMT, in fact, anything which says, okay, how are we going to deal with the problem of power corrupting? And power over currency is just about the most powerful thing that there is, because it's not directly forceful. It's not a gun to your head. You get to steal through inflation. You get to reward your friends. And it all looks like you're managing the economy. It all looks pretty good. But the amount of power that people have in that is so enormous. And I don't know how. And of course, the government doesn't want to teach you how the economic system works, because then you can try and figure out maybe the government isn't adding value in the way that they say they are. And I guess that's a big question, is the corruptibility of this power.
I would say you're right that that's probably not discussed a whole lot, because it's not really something. MMT doesn't claim to have the answer on this moral conundrum. MMT is more about observing the existing monetary system as it's here, as it's developed through history, and understanding it. And there are some MMT authors who then come up with recommendations on what should we do. But I think it's important to understand the mechanics first, and then there's different prescriptions. I agree with you. I mean, I agree with you that a big government can't be managed easily, and that power corrupts. And so I would say, as a libertarian who believes in MMT, I would say we need to keep the government small as possible, because if it's small, then taxation is low, then it doesn't need to spend as much to leave the private sector a bunch of money to function, if that makes sense.
Well, okay, so the current conception, whether it's right or wrong, we can sort of put to the side for the moment. That's my recommendation, obviously not a commandment. So the current conception is, well, the government's overspending because it's got a big deficit. And then people say, well, we've got to cut government, we've got to cut the size and scope and power of government and so on. And this happened in the late 90s in Canada, when the Canadian government was paying close to 40 cents on the dollar just in interest payments, and there was big cutbacks in the government, and it was actually done by the Liberals. Like the Nixon going to China thing, only the Liberals can cut spending, only the left can cut spending, because otherwise we all understand too much propaganda from the media on the right hates the poor and so on. And so if we have this conception and we say, well, we want to keep government small, I can't for the life of me, it could be a failure of my imagination, maybe that's a good answer, I can't for the life of me say, in my own mind, okay, well, we're going to keep government small by giving them no constraints, really, even mental constraints like you're not taxing enough to cover your expenses, by giving them the capacity and the right, and it's a plus thing, to create infinite money at whim. How on earth could that be part of the mechanics that would keep government small?
Well, it's not at whim. It's based on a process that is the budgetary process, and the parliament passes appropriations bills so money can be spent. There's no other way around addressing this issue than that process. And if the process is corrupt, if we say we can't do anything, well, then that's that's not good. But MMT has no solution for that. But the main point I just want to make is that, if we say the government is spending too much money on all these projects, I don't like it. Let's put a gold standard in place. That's not an answer to the problem of too large budgets passed in Congress. So that would be my answer. If there's one place where this problem of overspending can be addressed, and it's not a complicated answer, right? It's obviously the process where the decisions are made to spend this money, not the plumbing and the mechanics of the banking system and of the public finance system that facilitates this economy.
And I would add from another side is that in history, again, going back to the David Graeber goes into this in Debt in the First 5,000 Years, making the moral argument, is that so we had these periods where credit money dominated or bullion money, gold and silver money dominated. And a pattern that you see is during the eras of bullion money dominating are ages of universal warfare. And I think the simplest way to understand it is gold and silver can be stolen. So if gold and silver is money and you got gold and silver, I can go plunder it and I can melt it down and nobody knows where it came from and I can go spend it. Whereas if it's a credit system, yeah, there's way to like hack into your bank account and stuff, right? But it's not the same. It's not the same. Like, how do we break into Fort Knox and get all the gold?
There's a trust relationship associated with the token. You can't just eradicate a dead record. If you hack into it, maybe, but it's much easier to steal gold and then to immediately deploy it. Deploy those funds and buy things with it, or buy sell them for money, etc., without ever anyone knowing where it came from.
And to point back to what I said before is I don't know how to square this circle. I don't have the, now that I understand MMT, I don't have the solution for, well, here's how we solve the problem of giving a individual or a small group of individuals this incredible power on what to do, or on how to create money. And like you said, possibly even more importantly, who gets it first, or who gets it at all, or gets to create the regulations on what you're allowed to do with it. And, when we get into inflation and hyperinflation, I think that's also a very big factor of, okay, well, if we're in a communist country and you're not allowed to do anything unless you have specific permission, well, we can give you all the money you want, but you're not allowed to do anything with it. So of course it's going to hyperinflate.
Right. Sorry, go ahead.
But we were talking about gold money and the fact that I can't square the circle. I lose my train of thought really easily.
You can't square the circle of, what do we do with all this power? And...
Okay, so let's... no, go ahead.
I did remember the last thing I wanted to say, sorry, is that what we felt was that the first step to answering that problem, even though we don't know what the ultimate solution is let's understand how the system works. Let's, okay, we're playing a game of chess, and we realized someone taught us the completely wrong rules. Well, they're telling us a pawn can move like a bishop and a king can jump around like a knight, and we're just playing it completely wrong. And let's start with understanding the rules, and then we could start talking about, okay, how are we going to strategize? How are we going to play this game?
And also one more thing I would like to add to that. My primary focus in understanding MMT was not necessarily to solve the world's problems, but rather to make smarter financial decisions for myself. And I think the same should apply to everyone else. And from there, maybe then if we get more influence and if we understand the system better, we can make bigger changes. But if we don't understand the rules, then that's not going to happen.
Well, let
So
me
I
let me
really
just get
look at
behind
it
and
as-
push that forward a little bit, just to put it in context for my listeners, and I guess your listeners now too. But if you think of the Austrians, of course, the Austrian school has been predicting hyperinflation since 1971. Now, they got some of it, of course. You got inflation of 10.5% and stagflation under Carter in the 70s and so on. But ever since 2007, 2008 in particular, there has been this massive expectation of not just inflation, I think, but hyperinflation. Now, this is not all Austrians, but it's a lot of them, right? And so what have the Austrians done? What they've done, or the Austrian followers, the people who follow this school of thought, what they've done is they've gone to gold. They've gone to gold. Now, they didn't go to Bitcoin. They didn't go to S&P. They didn't go, they went to gold, and gold has stagnated for, give or take, decade and a half, could be a little longer. So if you went to gold in 2007, 2008, now 13, 14 years later, how has that investment decision paid off for you? Whereas if you maybe held off, got some Bitcoin or something else, right? So, or even if you'd just gone to regular economic standard, S&P 500 stuff. So this is where, always got to be willing to revisit your own perspectives and opinions. So when you're talking about specific financial decisions, the decision to go to gold was pretty bad in a lot of ways, but it was driven by an understanding that the money printing, and you always hear Zimbabwe, the money printing is going to cause massive inflation and gold is going to rise in value relative to the dollar and so on, which hasn't really happened. Now, Zimbabwe, of course, you look at these $100 trillion bills and so on, you say, oh, well, it's the money printing. It's like, I think the MMT argument, correct me if I'm wrong, the MMT argument would say, look, it's not, you ended up with a $100 trillion bill, not because the government printed a lot of money, but because it printed way more money than the economy was producing in goods and services. So when you had Mugabe, I think it was. So Mugabe, of course, kicked out all of the farmers, particularly the white farmers, who were very skilled, and it was a very complicated thing, just as it is in South Africa.
Point, yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, that's the main thing that really happened in Zimbabwe, and that's what created the hyperinflation, is the fact that the land reform occurred, that the people who were able to produce off of that land were kicked out, and the farms were raided by activists and just politically connected groups and all that. And so the productive capacity of the economy collapsed. And when you destroy your productive capacity, that's how you create hyperinflation. That's what that's MMT's theory about hyperinflation. For the most part, it's because of policies that destroy your productive capacity.
Well, and then to add to it, that this isn't the central point, but this is. Oh,
sorry. Let me just finish. Yeah. So then, when productive capacity collapses, prices go up, and when prices go up, the government has to print more money just because everything's more expensive. So the things that the government purchases also become more expensive. So they, because they're the money issuer, they have to print more and bigger bills to pay for those higher prices. So it's almost a causality might actually be inverse, where this policy of collapsing the economy creates the hyperinflation, and at the same time prices go up and more money has to be printed to pay those higher prices.
Yeah, because the cause and effect in the Austrian school, and again, I'm no expert, it's my understanding, is something like, well, the government prints a whole bunch of money that wrecks the economy, but the Zimbabwe example, clearly the wrecking of the economy occurred before the escalation in prices, and you don't want to get cause and effect backwards, because cause and effect are all about investment decisions, because if you get cause and effect backwards, you're chasing everyone else, which means you're probably going to lose money.
Well, and then I think it's also worth pointing out in the example of Zimbabwe, and there's actually an analogous example to Weimar, is that they were on a fixed currency system. They had pegged their money to the US dollar. And so when they had and because they were taking out loans in US dollars too, weren't they, right? So if they're taking out loans in US dollars and they have to pay back in US dollars, well, to Zimbabwe, the US dollar is a commodity because they can't create it. So in order for them to pay their loans back, they have to go on the open market and sell were they Zimbabwe dollars?
I think so.
Yeah, they have to sell Zimbabwe dollars in order to buy US dollars. Well, if you're just cranking that printing press to just go on the open market and immediately sell all this money, well, of course it's going to drive
your import prices go up, and that's another factor for hyperinflation.
Well, so this is a very, very important point, I think, for people to sort of really process. So if you look at the Argentina example, right? The Argentina borrowed a huge amount of US dollars because it could get a better interest rate from borrowing US dollars because they couldn't control US dollars, right? Now, if you borrow US dollars instead of using a currency that you yourself directly control as a government, then you could end up as a default, right? And
Yes.
but if you borrow someone else, so sometimes when you look at hyperinflation leading to economic collapse, and they say, well, this pushes back against the MMT theory. If I understand this correctly, the MMT theory does sidestep this pretty neatly by saying, well, no, look, if you borrow someone else's currency, then you're a currency consumer. You're not a currency creator. And the household rules then apply. It has to be something that you can create yourself in order to conform to the MMT theory.
Exactly.
Everyone, please like, comment, and subscribe to help us grow this channel. I think we cover a lot of good stuff. We're covering ideas that you're not hearing anywhere else. Economic ideas, historical ideas, systematic politics ideas you're not hearing anywhere else.